so excited to welcome Mel Francis to the webinar today. She's Director of Neurodiversity at DoIT. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, DoIT Solutions.
It's actually very small on my screen, so I was making sure that I got that right. There we go. So I'm so pleased. Fellow HR, most influential, teamed up to deliver this session, and I'm really excited about this morning. I think it's going to be really useful for people, and I know that I'm going to learn stuff from you, Mel, as well. So we will get cracking on this morning's proceedings. For those that don't know me, and there might well be some people on the call, I'm Nick Elliott, and I head the employment team at Actons Solicitors. Mel will introduce herself when we get to her section, which won't be too long, but she's going to be kicking us off. We work with a whole range of different employer clients, through from small startups to some household names that you will have heard of, the likes of Waterstones, Connell's Property Group, and people like that. So a real range, and we cover kind of the full range of employment law stuff that you would expect. We're talking a lot about the Employment Rights Act at the minute, unsurprisingly, with all the change that's coming, and it's really nice not to be talking about that, if I'm really honest, but because we've been doing that a lot, so it's lovely to be talking about a different, really important subject. The other thing I should say is do connect with me and the team on LinkedIn, because we are giving updates on a whole host of stuff that's changing really quickly when it comes to the Employment Rights Act. It is worth just getting your phone out. There's quite a lot of QR codes now on that slide as we've grown the team. But do connect with us there for pretty regular updates on what's changing. It's actually really tricky to keep track of all that stuff at the minute, because it is changing so much. And if you don't really use LinkedIn much at all, maybe now would be a good time to do that. I think Yvette's very kindly put my link to my profile there in the chat as well. The other thing that I just wanted to mention before we get started was the HRD Talks podcast. This is something I have the pleasure of hosting, talking to people, directors, HR directors, about their career journey and asking them to give us advice on the HR profession at large, how you can progress your career, topics of the day, and that kind of thing. As I did say, we do have some ERA resources, which again will come in the chat. There'll be a link there to that on our website. Which is really helpful, hopefully, some short form explainer videos and guides and that kind of thing, because it's pretty overwhelming in terms of what there is out there. So that's enough of the plugs from Actons. I'm sure Mel will have some stuff to share with you as well as we go through. But in terms of the session this morning, we thought it was worth just a quick overview. It is worth mentioning that you will get a recording of the session afterwards. That'll be emailed out to you, so it won't be a copy of the slides, but you will get a recording if you signed up for the session today, which hopefully is really useful for you. And we will be taking questions. There's a couple of spaces in the session. I imagine we'll have some time at the end for questions too, but do pop those in the chat as we go, if that would be helpful for you as well. And either Melanie or I will take a look at those either as we go or in those question and answer sessions. So what are we going to look at? We're going to look at what is neurodiversity. We're going to look at it particularly in the work context, and we're going to look at the DoIT profiler, which Mel will talk us through. And then we're going to get legal, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how this has worked in the Employment Tribunal and lessons that we can learn on that front. So that's the rough plan. If I've missed anything, no doubt Mel will now take control and remind me of those things too. But
never felt so important.
Take it away.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thanks, Nick. So as Nick said, I'm Mel Francis. I am the Director of Neurodiversity at Work at DoIT Solutions, which is a neurodiversity organisation which was founded by Professor Amanda Kirby, who I get to fangirl and work alongside every day. So we help with neurodiversity training, tools and consultancy. So I get to bring my HR experience, which is pretty substantial. I live in HR, I do, but I've worked in HR all my life, chartered fellow of the CIPD, and as Nick said, one of HR's most influential from last year, which was just amazing. So get to help organisations really to understand what neurodiversity is, what it isn't, and how we can be more neuro inclusive. And that's really what I'm going to focus on during today's session, is giving us an insight into neurodiversity. So firstly, let's start by explaining what neurodiversity is. And I know many of you on the call will have some experience of neurodiversity, lived experience. Hopefully, as HR professionals as well, you will know what this topic is, because as we will explain, this is increasingly coming into our area of work in HR. So neurodiversity is an umbrella term. And really the umbrella depends on who's holding the umbrella, whether you bought the umbrella, what colour the umbrella is, what it's made of, etc. Just to, but ultimately what's sitting under the umbrella are all conditions, traits, etc. that relate to our brains and the different way in which our brain is working. And our brains are all unique. And they are made up of billions of neurons connected in billions of different ways, 84 billion brain cells, etc. So, this is us, our unique way of our unique structure, right? So it means that there are no two brains that are the same. So in the same way that your fingerprint is unique to you, so is your brain unique to you, and there are no two that are the same. And so it means that we're all moving, thinking, acting, processing information and communicating differently. No one's doing that the same way as you. And so it means in workplaces that we really need to understand neurodiversity and understand that we are all neurodiverse, our brains are different. And I want to bring this to life for us in a short video, which I just clicked past, which is amazing. So I'm just going to play this video for you. Lovely to see some of the comments coming in about what a great explanation it is. I love this video and was so pleased to make it with the brilliant team at 10 to 3, who are a great company who make videos targeted actually at line managers to help them on the premise that it's 10 to 3, you got a meeting at 3, what do you need to know in the next 10 minutes to make it go well? So, and they really come at these videos from an ER perspective. So I'm going to give you my email address. If you want a copy of the video, send me an email and I will send it to you with a bit more information on the full suite of the videos. We made 8 of them as well, so happy to do that. So as we said, we are all neurodiverse because we all have a brain, but we're not all neurodivergent. And that's a really important distinction. And I know some people get really upset by this notion that we're all neurodiverse. What I'm not saying is we're all a bit on the spectrum, which is obviously like one of those really phrases that people put out there, but we do all have different brains. And the reason why I'm not saying we're all somewhere on the spectrum is because I think it's a really important distinction. And I'm going to show you this crazy diagram, which is a really important one. And I'm kind of sorry, not sorry that it's so crazy, because what this is attempting to do is to visually represent the way in which neurodiversity is working, right? So what you can see on here, we've just got 6 of the conditions highlighted, but lots of other conditions sitting around the outside. I'm going to talk you through what some of those abbreviations stand for. But essentially, you'll see the 6 main conditions, and then you'll see lines kind of going across, because the overlap of traits and conditions is really prevalent and is the rule rather than the exception. All of us have got different traits, different overlaps, and yet sometimes what we're focusing in on are just 1 or 2 particular conditions. At the moment, I have to say that the 2 conditions that we're talking about the most are autism and ADHD. Right, that's the one, or they're the ones where we see the most conversation, we see the most amount of referrals being made for diagnosis, etc., and we see the biggest wait list, and we see a provision for services for those 2 conditions. But actually, they're just 2 of lots of different neurodiverse conditions. And if we are focusing in on diagnosis for that one condition, what we're doing is missing the rest of the brilliance that is going on in our brains. So if we're pursuing a diagnosis for autism, for example, or for ADHD, we're just looking at whether or not the traits are meeting the threshold to be diagnosed with that condition, with ADHD. We're not looking at everything else. And the important thing to remember is 84 billion brain cells connected in billions of different ways. If we're just looking at that bit, we're missing everything else that might be going on. So what we can see here, as I said, 6 of the conditions. So developmental language disorder, which is, actually I'm going to go in order, dyslexia, the most prevalent neurodiverse condition, which is a condition, dys means difficulty with, lexia, word stuff. So dyslexia, this is looking at difficulties with comprehension, reading, decoding, spelling, and syllabification, which I think is just the best word relating to dyslexia. So it's breaking words down into syllables. Around 10% of the population diagnosed with dyslexia. So in the context of the UK, that would mean the whole of London being diagnosed with dyslexia, which I think we would definitely be talking about if that was the case. So, and it's also probably the one that we've known about for the longest amount of time. So really, the diagnosis for dyslexia has been around for the longest amount of time. And I think it's the one we feel most comfortable with as well, I have to say. If people say, oh, I'm dyslexic, we're like, oh, cool, good, okay. So, we will talk about dyslexia quite openly. DLD, developmental language disorder, which is the 2nd highest level of prevalence of diagnosis, 7 to 10% with DLD. And this is a condition that relates to our ability to, with language, really, communicating, receiving, deciphering language. So this is about how we speak, interact, understand, process information, the pragmatics that sit around that too. 2nd highest level of prevalence. Then we get to dyscalculia, which is difficulties with calculia, numbers stuff. which is relating to numbers, and it again varies. All of these vary, right? We don't have to have all of this to be able to reach the diagnostic threshold, or indeed to have strengths and challenges, although the diagnoses are based on your levels of challenges. You're not getting a diagnosis because you're brilliant at number stuff, right? You're getting a diagnosis because you are struggling with number stuff to such an extent that you meet the diagnostic threshold. The diagnostic thresholds are really clear. They are set out in a couple of Bibles, if you like. So the one that most diagnosticians use is called the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual. We're on DSM-5 that was introduced in 2013, and that version, put some changes in, which I'll come to when we get to ASC, which I know someone's asked for the acronym for, and I know you're answering each other, which is perfect. So dyscalculia, number stuff, and this can really vary from not having an appreciation of what numbers even mean, what's six, that kind of level, to thinking about things like difficulties with orientation, with time concepts, reading timetables. Some of you might work with rotas in your organization, so that can be tricky for some people. So dyscalculia. Next, in terms of levels of diagnosis, we get to ADHD. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, around 5% prevalence, which is far lower than the conversation would suggest at the moment, isn't it? I think, we're talking about ADHD a lot more. If you spend 5 minutes on TikTok, you can determine that you have ADHD traits, probably, in some of the ways in which this is all being represented, which is tricky, right? So this sort of way of thinking that you have deficits or struggles, etc., and that means that you have ADHD or you have autism is not necessarily the case. You might have balls in your bucket, as shown in that video, but not necessarily reaching the threshold to be diagnosed. And as I said, we've all got different balls in the bucket, so it's really important that we recognize strengths and challenges, which is what we in HR spend lots of time doing. I'm sure many of you have got insights discovery and Myers-Briggs, with psychometrics we tend to be very accepting of and talking those things through. Funnily enough, we don't do the same type of thing for the ways in which our brains are working here, which is interesting. But back to ADHD, as we've been distracted by that. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It includes traits such as hyperactivity and fidgety, but not always. So the attention, the deficit, hyperactivity, the disorder, these things are not, don't always describe the way in which somebody experiences ADHD. They might have the opposite. They might be inattentive. So the ADHD and autism, which I'm going to come to, were both the diagnostics for them were created back in the 1980s. They were created by observing boys, created by men observing boys, interestingly. And so there's very male traits playing out in the diagnostic. And we really, that took hold during the 80s into the 90s until we had a different view of the way in which some of these traits were playing out in girls and women. So to be very stereotypical about it, while we were watching the fidgety boy who couldn't sit still in the classroom, we were missing the dreamy girl whose hyperactivity, if you like, or activity was far more internalized. So that kind of not dreamy, but really busy brain, but not necessarily externalized in terms of movement and activity. We now have learned so much more about ADHD, and in fact, who knew we have hormones as well, us girls? And so what happens is, whereas our estrogen levels are dropping on a monthly basis and then hitting the dopamine, it can be far more difficult for us to be able to to mask and cope with those kinds of traits as well. Then we get to menopause, and perimenopause and menopause means that our estrogen levels are kind of all over the place, and so that kind of interaction with dopamine means that we have even more struggles at that stage. So we're seeing far more women who are coming forward seeking diagnosis or answers to what's going on for them as they get to those stages in life. So sleep disturbance can be a real issue here. Busy brain. This is the only condition where medication might be really useful for somebody, which is why at the moment this kind of push towards diagnosis is because some people want to be able to get medication, and you need a diagnosis to get medication. Now, word of caution, right? When there is a high level of demand, what happens is you get the cowboys coming in to help you with the demand, right? So there's lots of people who are offering services for diagnosis, and I would just suggest you do a healthy amount of due diligence around that too. Okay. Background to dyspraxia, developmental coordination disorder or dyspraxia. So slightly less, actually slightly more prevalent than ADHD. I should have done that one first. But dyspraxia, difficulties with coordination. I don't know how praxia moves into that. I'm sure there's some medical explanation for that. But this is about gross and fine motor coordination predominantly, but also affects our executive functioning and our ability to sort of organize ourselves too. So this fine motor coordination, so things like being able to hold a pencil, or our handwriting, painting, etc. So that really sort of fine motor coordination. So anyone on the call who has kids in a school where you have pen passports, we need to gather together to start a movement to ban the pen passports, which is this situation where kids, once they have such beautiful handwriting, they can graduate from a pencil to a Beryl handwriting pen. Some kids are never going to be able to do it because they just don't have the fine motor coordination to be able to do that. And that's like one of the earliest ways in which kids are being highlighted as being different in classrooms, because they're not achieving that pen passport thing. And I know that happens in lots of schools in lots of different ways. So fine motor coordination, but also gross motor coordination. So thinking about spatial awareness. One of the things as an adult where we have coordination requirements, if you like, a new skill that we learn as an adult is when you're driving. And some of us are going to struggle more with learning to drive than others. So and also once we learn to drive, we might have lack of spatial awareness, which might mean that we're sort of dinging our car left, right and centre. Oh, didn't see that bollard, or we need a few more wing mirrors than others. So dyspraxia there. And then lowest in terms of prevalence is autistic spectrum condition, ASC, or autistic spectrum disorder, ASD. In the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual that was introduced in 2013, the introduction of a couple more umbrellas under the umbrella were for ASC. So what happened in 2013 was that diagnostics for specific conditions like Asperger's or Asperger's and high functioning autism were taken out. So really no one should have been diagnosed with those since 2013. But of course, they're still terms that we are familiar with, that we hear about, etc., because that's how people choose to identify. And, it's not for us to go, I think you'll find that was not a diagnosis since 2013. We have to listen. But essentially, there was a move to move away from the names. So Asperger, if you look him up, very horrible, evil man relating to Nazi Germany, and worked closely with Hitler. So really not a name you want to be associated with. And then Jean de Tourette, Tourette's syndrome, now sits under tic disorders. But autism, autistic spectrum condition, is a condition where really we see the world around us in a different way. So experiencing the world differently. And it means that we can have some of the challenges which relate to the diagnostic include things like sensory preferences or specific interests. This is where our real specialists are. This isn't just skimming the surface of understanding a topic that you're passionate about. This is going deep into the specific interests as well. Also, things like challenges with change, transitions are really tricky for some people. So when we've got all these change activities going on, it's really important that we give people enough time to be able to get to grips with what's going on and how it's impacting them, and differences in being able to do those kinds of things too. And that can apply to all of us, right? Don't have to have autistic traits for that, but for some who have autistic spectrum condition, that could be particularly tricky. Also, things like sensory preferences, too bright, too noisy, too itchy, those types of things can be traits that we see playing out here. I'll also just pull out here camouflaging, which was so important. We put it in twice, apologies, but camouflaging is where we see that you experience, or your experience of an individual might be one thing when they are home or in their safe space, able to drop the mask, then it can feel very different. And we particularly see this in girls and women. So we think it's because us girls feel like we want to fit in with our peers more than boys tend to be bothered about. So we mirror what's going on, we look at how others are behaving, and we mirror that. And that can be exhausting when we are masking all day in a work environment or a school environment. And so when we drop the mask, it can mean that we have a very different experience. And I hear this quite commonly. Actually, someone I was talking to yesterday was telling me a guy who was diagnosed with autism in his 40s, and now he feels like he can drop his mask because he's got more explanation of why he finds things more tricky than others. Running around the outside of this diagram, I've got lots of abbreviations. So these are things that are important and sit under the umbrella here too. So hearing impairment is up here, HI, moving around, CP, cerebral palsy, VI, visual impairment, JHS, joint hypermobility syndrome, Beck's, which is benign Rolandic epilepsy with centrotemporal spikes. There you go. It's a form of epilepsy. TBI, traumatic brain injury, really important because, our brains are so delicate, and where we may have a brain injury, it can impact our behaviours. So any good diagnostician will want to be exploring whether brain injury is a factor here and whether that might be an explanation rather than neurodiverse traits and conditions. As we're young, our prefrontal cortex is still developing. And so, when we have brain injuries or heading balls, so lots of research going into the impact that heading balls has on people too. And we are seeing a significant number of people coming through the system who have brain injury as a related consideration as well. Mental health and neurodiversity crossover is massive. So we have some mental health conditions here too. So ARFID is a type of, it stands for avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. So it's an eating disorder. OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. BPD, borderline personality disorder. BD, bipolar disorder. And tic disorders I've briefly mentioned. Tic disorders includes Tourette syndrome, and we've I think in the last few weeks seen so much more in the press about coprolalia, which is the swearing version of Tourette syndrome, and a brilliant film which is available now on Netflix called I Swear, which a great way of showing that. But actually that only impacts around 10% of those with a tic disorder. So again, this sort of notion of the level of conversation, so with Tourette syndrome, with autism, with ADHD, might not correlate with the levels of prevalence as well. auditory processing disorder is APD. Then over on the right, I've got here these other factors, other things that are really impacting. So we've got neglect and abuse, exclusion, poor housing, poor nutrition, kids in care, poor schooling, right? At the moment, 80% of children in coming through youth offending have developmental language disorder. So we've got other, this is really important that we have these other factors to take into account. And sometimes it's because, when we're in these sort of situations, our ability to access services is not going to be as available as it is to others. There's a real socio-economic situation going on here. And then top left-hand corner, what we've got are neurodivergent parents, right? We are born with our brilliant neurodivergent brains, our neurodiverse brains, our genetics are passed through generations and generations. But we have got the diagnostics only really being talked about in the 70s for dyslexia, in the 80s for autism and ADHD, and so on. Actually, adult ADHD you couldn't have had until the year 2000. But of course, we all have these brains that have been there forever. And actually, if these traits weren't useful to us as a human being, they would have been evolved out along the way. But what it means is that we may have parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, etc., who had no correlation between the way in which their brains work and neurodiverse conditions. There's been no label to attribute to the types of behaviors and traits. But of course, this hasn't really changed. So we have neurodivergent parents now, I hear frequently, where kids are being diagnosed who start to recognize that within themselves. So again, move towards adults exploring their own neurodivergence. If you want this diagram, email me, I'll send it to you with the video as well. So really important here for us to take this into account, right? So I've said billions of brain cells connected in billions of different ways. What it means is that our brains are not nice, neat buckets. When we look at this diagram and the diagnostic is looking at just that one thing, it's missing everything else that's going on, including these strengths. And what it means is that it's missing the overlaps. Because if you're going to see a specialist in autism, for example, they are not always going to be looking at everything else. At the moment, we have got diagnosticians who are diagnosing autism and ADHD together. So some people now are talking about ADHD, but not necessarily looking at everything in entirety, which is what the Do It profiler is doing, not for a diagnosis, but as a bigger picture. But I'll talk to you about that in a sec. And what we know from the data that we've got through Do It Profiler is that the overlap between conditions is the rule, not the exception. We've got nearly 80% of people with autism traits who have developmental coordination disorder or dyspraxia traits. That is the biggest overlap we see. A third with dyspraxia having ADHD traits, a third with ADHD traits having autism traits, and we're seeing those diagnoses coming through now. A fifth with ADHD traits having tic disorders, fifth with tic disorder having developmental language disorder, half developmental language disorder having dyslexia, half with dyslexia with dyscalculia, 2 in 5 with dyscalculia having developmental language disorder. And this is just one cut of the data, right? We can keep cutting. The message will be the same. Overlap is the rule rather than the exception. And it's really important that we're looking more broadly than one particular condition. Now, each year for the last 4 years, we have worked with City and Guilds Foundation to create the Neurodiversity Index report. This is hot off the press that we published this last week, which is great. So what we do every year, we go to employers and employees and ask to hear what's going on now within organizations. And of course, we've seen so much flux around this topic. This time last year was a bit tricky after Donald Trump made it illegal to talk about EDI in the US. And the impact that had on us was real, wasn't it? That kind of bit of a shift, especially if you've got a US owned organization that you're working in, shift in the way in which we were talking about diversity and particularly neurodiversity. And so, you know, it kind of really impacted. This stat, though, that I've pulled out, there's lots of data in here, by the way, it's such a useful report. But this I thought was really important to pull out how confident employers are feeling. So they're saying that around up to 80% senior leaders of 78 to 80% are feeling that their organizations are ready to talk about neurodiversity. Contrast that, though, with 32 to 38% of employees still saying that they don't feel safe to disclose. So there's a gap between employers going, yeah, we've got it, we're done, we're good. And then employees going, I'm not going to tell you. So it means that you have employees who are neurodivergent. We're all neurodiverse. Some of us are neurodivergent. You're already in your workforce, you've got brilliant individuals, right? Which is why you recruit them, but they're not necessarily going to tell you. And there are opportunities for us to be neuro-inclusive at every stage of our employee life cycle. And if we apply universal design principles to the way in which we organize our work, the way in which we deliver information, all of this, and be person-centered, then we can make a real difference in terms of being neuro-inclusive. At Do It, we have the Neurodiversity Profiler. This is a neurodiversity screening tool. We just flagged here at the moment our children's profiler for Neurodiversity Celebration Week, which is this week. Who knew we were so timely with this? It's just £15 for the children's profiler, but we've got adults profilers, workplace profiler. We've got contextualized to different organizations as well. But essentially what this is a web-based screening tool for neurodiversity and well-being. It's quick, accurate, gives you an easy to read instant report with practical guidance. It's an online portal, so when you access it, it looks a bit like this. We've got videos on each stage to help you to work your way through it. And then once you've completed this is the neurodiversity screener, it gives you a report which gives you your neurodiversity profile. So it gives you your level of traits across the 6 main neurodiverse conditions. It's not a diagnostic, it's a screener, but it does focus in on what your strengths are and what your challenges are. And I think that's really important, actually. Sometimes more important, most times, more important than understanding what your neurodiversity profile is. But it also looks at our well-being. So it has a well-being module in, which is looking at how you're doing. How are you at work? How are you at home? How's your physical well-being? How's your mood? And again, pulls out our strengths and our challenges at the moment in relation to well-being, and then instant reports that have PDF resources for you to be able to utilize as well. So I think it's a brilliant tool, but I genuinely think from an HR perspective now, there is no way I would be progressing an ER case that had a neurodiversity consideration without utilising a tool such as the Do It Profiler to enable us to make sure that we've got the information that we need to take into account before we're making any final decisions, because those final decisions can come and bite us on the bum, which is what Nick's going to help us to understand a bit better. So we just wanted to pick up on any key questions before we get legal. So Nick, has anything sort of stood out from the chat, which I'm trying not to...
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. So it's one of the most active chats that I think I've ever seen on a webinar, which is great. And you're right, you had identified that people were actually answering each other's questions, which is also good. So really there's nothing, I think there's probably a few that have just come through now. We do have some time at the end. If you want to either have a look as I talk, or we can pick them up at the end. There's a couple in there that I think might be part of my session as well. But certainly lots of people saying how good the profiler looks. So
yes, super helpful.
That's excellent. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, let's get legal, as the title suggests. And as Mel said, I think it's worth, just from a legal perspective, putting some of this into context in terms of how employers are best to manage these kinds of situations and what lessons we can learn from where it's gone wrong. And there's certainly plenty out there to suggest that claims in the employment tribunal involving neurodiversity in some way or another are dramatically on the rise. We see that in the press. Mel very kindly shared a graph that you can hopefully see there, and without, whether you can see the detail or not, the lines are very clearly going in one direction in terms of seeing a significant increase in claims involving some element of neurodiversity. So it's very much a live issue for employers in terms of managing those situations well, supporting people well, and I guess minimizing legal risk, is the other side of it for employers too. So we're going to look at in a bit more detail at that. I guess the starting point, I wanted to be clear that I appreciate that many people with a kind of neurodivergent condition, and again, I've seen in the chat, there are people with differing views as to the right labels and that kind of thing. But often they will not consider themselves disabled. And I guess, having listened very carefully to what Mel was talking about, I totally understand that. But at the moment, the main protection that is in place for people when it comes to discrimination in the workplace relates to disability discrimination. So that's what we're going to look at in terms of how that all fits together. And I guess the key message for me is that actually we really do have to look at this on a case-by-case basis, and that's the case for any condition, any disability, for the purposes of the Equality Act, and that's the bit of legislation that we're talking about in the main. And we're going to look at that definition because it is very much okay. Well, what impact does this have on that individual? It's not possible just to say, well, actually, because I think I have this or that, or I've looked into this myself, then I necessarily will meet the definition when it comes to the Equality Act. In the same way as Mel pointed out, that there's maybe a diagnostic threshold when it comes to this area as well, there is definitely a legal threshold when it comes to protection in this area. Now, that's not to say that employers shouldn't be looking at things like adjustments, reasonable adjustments, the legal phrase that we will refer to as we go, for anybody in reality who needs assistance at work. And I guess that's the other thing just to remember, is we don't need to think, oh gosh, might this be a legal disability under the Equality Act, to actually be supporting our people with things that they say they need. So that's the kind of the context for that. In terms of the actual legal claims that we're looking at, it's a little bit technical. I'll try and keep it high level, but when it comes to disability discrimination, there are different types of disability discrimination. Direct discrimination is probably the least common these days, as in it's an employer discriminating against somebody because of their disability, and it's not usually quite as kind of obvious as that. It tends to be other things like a policy that's put in place that disadvantages somebody, which in this example on the slide is described as indirect disability discrimination. So that might be a performance management process that's in place, or in fact an absence management process, or that kind of thing. There's then disability discrimination arising from the condition, and the best example I have of that is that if an employer is managing somebody's absence, that absence may arise from a disability, and that's the type of discrimination that we'd be looking at there if the disability meets the threshold. And then the one that most people have heard of, and again that employees will often raise with their employers, is reasonable adjustments. And that's essentially looking at how do we alleviate a disadvantage that somebody with a particular condition has in order that they are put on a level playing field, essentially, with other people in the workplace. There's reference to justification there, which applies to the arising from disability discrimination indirect, and that's basically best described, or I best describe it as sort of a business reason, or a reason that the employer puts forward to justify discrimination. So essentially, the tribunal will look at it and say, okay, well, yes, we can see that this is discriminatory in some way, but actually the employer can justify it for other reasons. And we'll look a little bit at that in due course. In terms of the legal definition itself, it's set out in the Equality Act, and it's worth just having a look at that, because the key here really is that not every person will be disabled. They have to meet the criteria, the definition set out in the Equality Act, and therefore actually it's sometimes difficult for employers to think, well, what's the risk here? Do we need to treat this as a disability or not? And in some ways, I would encourage employers not to think too much about that in reality, and actually just to deal with the situation that's in front of them. Because as I say, if an employee is struggling in some way and needs some support, then actually providing that makes sense, regardless of whether it's legally a disability or not. But the definition is that if the person has a physical or mental impairment, and that impairment has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So actually, it rolls off the tongue, as you can tell. And we could, again, spend a whole session breaking down each of those individual parts, and there are endless cases about what substantial means and what long-term means, and what day-to-day activities are, and so on. But as part of the session a few slides on, we'll look at some of the cases in this area where this definition has been considered in this context. So hopefully that will be useful for us moving forward. The other thing that often I'm asked is, okay, well, what advice and support? And again, I think it came up in the chat a number of times, is there for employers looking to navigate this area well? Do we need to speak to the individual's GP? Have they got a formal diagnosis of some kind? Do we need to look at occupational health? That kind of thing. And I think it's obviously you could look at the Do It profiler, for example, and that would help. And I agree with Mel. I think employers understanding that in more detail can only be helpful when you're managing an ER case, that is set in this context. But I think increasingly I am seeing referrals to occupational health on a more regular basis. I've seen occupational health providers producing new tools in order to assess neurodiversity in a way that perhaps in previous years I hadn't, and it was a bit more of a lottery as to which occupational health practitioner you got and whether they were skilled to actually help with those areas. So I think certainly my take on this is that support from people who actually know what they're doing in this area is really, really important for HR professionals who are being asked to manage these issues. And I think with any condition, I generally take the view is that employers are not supposed to know the ins and outs of the medical side of things. Neither are they best placed to assess what reasonable adjustments might be necessary and so on. And that's in particular occupational health's role to kind of bring those two things together and help advise employers on what's best. And also employees don't always know what's best for them too. And therefore having a professional involved in some way to help assess that is really, really useful. It is worth just remembering things like employee consent to those kinds of requests, so making sure that you either have that lined up yourself or your occupational health provider. Often they're helping with that these days in terms of ensuring that we have proper consent and GDPR is complied with and all that good stuff. And I think again I might have seen a comment in the the chat around whether a kind of formal diagnosis is required for the kind of duty to consider reasonable adjustments to be triggered. And I don't think so, though it's helpful. So if somebody comes and says, I have a formal diagnosis, then obviously you're on notice very easily that that there is a condition here that might well meet the legal definition. And I guess that's the other thing just to keep in mind is there might be a medical diagnosis of a condition, but there's also the legal definition, and those things will sit next to each other but won't necessarily mean that someone is disabled under the Equality Act every single time. And again, when we look at some of the cases, we will explore that. But it seems likely that at the very least you should be considering the possibility that that will be met. And in reality, it only requires, well, the only person that can decide whether that definition, the legal definition, is met is an employment judge in an employment tribunal, should you get there eventually. So we're all kind of working on our best, I was going to say best guess, it's a bit more formal than that, but we're looking at that in a way that we think, okay, well, yes, we think it's likely in the future that if we were to end up in an employment tribunal, that an employment judge might well decide that this meets the definition. And of course, we can look at that definition in more detail, and make that assessment too. So self-diagnosis, I think, is essentially, your employee putting you on notice that they believe that they have a condition that you need to take into account. And I think the reality is, and again, it's very clear from Mel's session, that everybody has a degree of support that is necessary in certain areas, and getting too caught up in, is this meeting the legal definition of disabled, do we need to consider reasonable adjustments in a really formal way, I think isn't that helpful, when actually most employers will want to ensure that they're including everybody, supporting everybody in a way that will get them to perform at their best for the employer. So I think that's an important point to remember. In terms of where things do go wrong, a lot of the issues that we see do involve a failure to consider reasonable adjustments. So effectively, an employer is either told formally that there's a neurodiversity issue in the mix, and don't take any consideration of that, don't make any adjustments for that individual, or they should be aware that there's something here that they need to consider, and there's sufficient evidence to put them on notice that it's worth exploring, and again, they fail to do so. A lot of that is also driven by a lack of awareness, in particular from managers. And one of the things that Mel and I certainly would encourage is managers to be trained on why this stuff is important, how they best manage these things and manage conversations well, and so on. And again, very often that flows into performance management issues, where someone's not performing in the way that the employer hopes, but actually there's a neurodiversity angle there, and that's missed or not taken into account and not managed well. And again, we'll see that in some of the cases that we look at. The other thing that I fairly regularly see is that there isn't sufficient medical advice or input, particularly from occupational health, to assist the employer in terms of managing these situations in the best way. So let's see where people have done this badly. Generally, that tends to be why we end up with a reported case that we can then learn from. And obviously, this is all aimed at avoiding falling into these traps and minimizing the risk here. The first case we're going to look at, I guess, kind of sets the scene for a condition meeting the requirements of that legal definition in the Equality Act. And Mr. Hewitt was, I think, a firmware engineer at Motorola. I just about understand what that means. There were some concerns raised about, I think, performance and conduct here, on the basis that there were some difficulties around social interaction. And actually, it was autism spectrum disorder in this case. And this one bounced, I think, back into between the first tier employment tribunal and what's called the Employment Appeals Tribunal. And what they basically decided was that it is possible for this condition to have a substantial adverse effect on day-to-day activities on the basis that it would impact communication and the subtleties of communication. And I think in this example, the tribunal basically got it wrong, and it was sent back to the tribunal again to have another go, because the Employment Appeals Tribunal decided that they hadn't taken everything into consideration properly, and essentially, you know, that the employer hadn't taken proper account of the difficulties with social interaction in that case. So it's obviously quite an old case now, so we're looking at 20 plus years ago, and I think an important one that kind of sets the scene for that legal definition potentially being met. The other one's a slightly, or the next one's a slightly strange one in that I think it was a Scottish case, and it actually involves a school pupil. So it's worth remembering that actually the Equality Act is broader than just employers, and that people can bring claims against organisations on the basis of goods and services, and not just employment. And this was an interesting case involving ADHD, where a pupil was, I think, suspended for an incident that had taken place at the school. And actually, she argued that that was an overreaction, and the action that the school had taken was inappropriate because her ADHD affected her decision making and also her social skills. And there was, again, an assessment of whether in this particular case, and this goes back to my point about each case being really important to assess on its own facts, that actually in terms of her day-to-day activities, she went about those in what they described as an entirely normal fashion. Now, quite how you decide that is an interesting one, and that she was able to live at a boarding school, go out on cinema outings without any particular special considerations. And the tribunal found that in this example that ADHD did impact on social skills, but the effect was not substantial enough to meet the legal definition. So on this occasion, actually that threshold was not met. The criteria for being disabled under the Equality Act was not met, and therefore on that basis, as with every disability discrimination claim, that would fall away at that point. So an example of the kind of varying protection that's in place depending on the severity, I guess, of the condition, as is the same for, you know, other things like, you know, back pain or menopause or whatever it might be. We do get these situations where people might report the same or similar conditions, but actually the threshold for meeting the definition can be different. Next case is NPower, again a few years ago. And the employee here was required to work in an open plan setting. And again, in the modern workplace, that's very often the case these days. Gone are the days of, you know, little offices hidden away in a building. A lot of us tend to be in open plan, and that presents challenges for some people. And employee here felt overwhelmed and distracted. I think that there was reference to the fact that there was a walkway behind his desk. I think there were even some like works going on near the building, and it sounded like a very distracting environment to be in. And again, employer took the view here that there were capability issues, so subjected employee to performance management process. And perhaps unsurprisingly, as a result of the autism that the employee, I think actually initially was self-diagnosing as having, brought claims for disability discrimination on a number of different grounds, on indirect and failure to make reasonable adjustments. And again, the tribunal looked at this and actually were a bit scathing of the employer in this example, suggesting that there was a continuous management failure to understand the employee's disability and a failure to make reasonable adjustments for it. And actually, the line manager in particular was criticised for not really knowing what autism meant, and that actually there'd been no training that had taken place in order to support managers across the organisation to do that. I'm not aware that actually the employer disputed the disability in this case, but the claim was successful at the point that the employee had been dismissed following that. So again, an example of an employer getting it wrong. I do think particularly that line manager support, awareness and training is a particular point to pull out there, where actually it might well have helped had that manager understood what was actually going on here, and maybe avoided that particular issue. The next case is an interesting one too. So Mr. Hayes worked at Scania, a bit more of a recent case, was dismissed after threatening a colleague, and ADHD was at play in this example. The employer didn't dispute that Mr. Hayes had ADHD, but he was dismissed for threatening a colleague who he suspected of tampering with his lunch. And again, if you read the case, it goes into quite a lot of detail as to what was done to the lunch, essentially. So it says that the crisps were smashed up and there were finger holes put through the sandwiches and a tea bag ripped open and spread out. So it sounded, like quite an unpleasant thing to have done. But Mr. Hayes' reaction to that was to email at least one colleague, I think on multiple occasions, threatening them and saying that they would pay for this and that he would, I think, cut the valves off their tires or this kind of thing. So clearly an issue that the employer needed to involve themselves in, and took some steps, and actually they decided that it was such a serious situation that he was dismissed. He claimed that ADHD resulted in impulsivity, and that was why he had been so threatening towards the colleague as a result of this thing that had been done to his lunch, and brought claims again on a whole range of things. You can see from that third bullet point pretty much every type of disabilities discrimination and unfair dismissal. But actually the tribunal found that those claims failed, so he was unsuccessful in that scenario. And this comes back to that justification point that I mentioned at the beginning, where essentially the employer were able to successfully argue that yes, okay, that might have been that his ADHD contributed to the impulsivity and the aggression that was shown, but actually the employer had a legitimate aim that allowed them to justify them protecting staff from threatening behaviour or aggressive behaviour. And I think in particular they took into account in this example that it was repeated emails, saying threatening things and so on. So it wasn't just a one-off, I struggled on this occasion because I was angry. It was a repeated thing. And I think again they looked into the fact that he, despite his ADHD, he was able to tell right from wrong, and admitted that this had been wrong, and therefore the employer were able to justify the dismissal in those circumstances. So I thought an interesting one in terms of how employers might manage what's okay and what's not, and how to navigate that, where someone's suggesting that actually it's a condition that's contributing to the way that they're behaving. So we're almost coming into land, and we will have some time for questions as well. In terms of how to protect your organisation, we've talked about some of these things already. Increasingly, I'm seeing neurodiversity policies being put in place. Part of that kind of raising awareness, I suppose, a commitment to employees that, you know, we're an inclusive workplace, and this is how we, you know, view these issues. Manager training is definitely on the up, both on this issue and a whole load of other issues, partly, I think, driven by a new focus on employee rights as a result of the Employment Rights Act. Obviously, having a profiler like Do It is a good idea too. We've talked about that as well. And having a good occupational health provider, I think, is also really, really important. We often recommend Smart Clinic, who we have recommended a number of times on webinars previously, not because we have any particular relationship with them or commission arrangement or anything like that, just because we found them to be very responsive and produce good reports that actually answer questions and the like. So do check them out if that's helpful. And then generally raising awareness, so sessions like this, you know, and sharing the kind of information that Mel has very kindly shared with us, with managers, and no doubt that's why lots of you are asking for graphs and diagrams and videos and the like, and I think that's really important. Obviously, this week is a big part of that too. And just before we get to questions, I had just a couple of other things to mention. Obviously, training we've talked about being super important, and if that is of interest, we are providing training on a whole load of different topics, including this, navigating tribunals, disciplinaries, grievances, all that kind of stuff. So if that would be of interest, do let us know. We also have something called a sickness absence audit, which again is increasingly popular with changes that are coming with regards to SSP and long-term sick being on an increase. We effectively look at your systems, processes, how you approach absence, and produce a report which then helps you address those and effectively tighten up on those issues too, which again is a cost saving to most employers if they can reduce those absence levels. So that's hopefully helpful. Again, the QR code should take you to the right place, but I think Yvette has also put some links in the chat to those things too. So Mel, I've deliberately been ignoring the chat with a view to trying to focus on what I was saying. So I don't know if there are any questions that have come up or any that you wanted to answer so that people have a break from me talking.
Yes. I think it's been really great. I think that, you know, as it's been such an active chat and helping each other through as well. But I think there's a couple of themes that I wanted to pick up on. This notion that the employment tribunal judge is ultimately the one who makes a decision about whether or not somebody is classified as being disabled under the terms of the Equality Act, and then determines whether or not the steps that the organisation have taken have been reasonable, right? I think for me, this is worst case scenario, right? We don't want to be in a position where we're leaving all that in the hands of the employment tribunal judge, do we? Because any of us that have ever been involved in a tribunal know that this is not a fun day out or fun week out, or you know, and actually that is like the very tip of the iceberg of all of the work that goes in beforehand. So I think we need to be anticipatory in terms of supporting the business in helping to navigate these cases in the best possible way, don't we? And you know, a couple of questions came up about how do we determine what's a reasonable adjustment. Do we want to pick up on that a bit as a conversation? Because I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So I agree with you, and that's kind of what I was trying to get at with the. Actually, we should be supporting everybody to do their best work and feel like they can at work. And I agree. Whether we label it as reasonable adjustments or not, it might well be if that becomes necessary at some point. We might be thinking, actually, yes, this is very clearly a disability, and you know that obligation kicks in. But it might not be. It might be that actually we have a member of our team who says, you know what, I get really easily distracted, you know, in the office. Please, can I have some ear defenders? Or please, could I move to a slightly quieter part of the open plan floor or whatever it might be. Now, they may not mention anything to do with neurodiversity. They may not say, I'm raising a grievance about this. It may not get, really kind of full on in that way. But actually, that would be a good thing to consider. And actually, if those things are the case, then, you will have ticked your legal boxes. But I agree with you, living in the world of, is there legal risk? Is there legal risk? Is there legal risk all of the time is not a great place to be. I think being more positive around how do we help these people do their best work and support them is a good idea. In terms of what's reasonable, in terms of reasonable adjustment, like how long have you got? It's one of
about 17 minutes.
I was going to say, I think we do a session on disability discrimination and sickness absence and all that kind of thing, which again, we go into more detail on that. Unfortunately, from my side, it's one of those it depends this kind of answers, and it even factors like the size of your organization and the resources that you have available to you and the like come into play. So if you're a massive great big corporate and somebody needs something that costs some money, then the tribunal is much more likely to expect you to have considered that and potentially implemented it than a two-person, two-director company with 5 employees that turns over, I don't know, less than $500,000 or that kind of thing. But I think if when an employer is considering it, in theory it looks fairly straightforward to do, then it's there's going to be an obligation there. The example I often go back to, I think it was a case, I can't remember the name of it, and this is where I need James in my team because he remembers all the case names, but it was a lady that couldn't hear very well and needed something like a £50,000 piece of equipment to be able to do the job that she was doing. And there was a big case around that as to whether the employer spending £50,000 on that kind of adjustment was reasonable or not. So but most things are not as expensive or as complicated to think about as that. So again, I think having a good business reason to decline a request from somebody is the key. But clearly, if on the face of it, and again, it's fairly common sense stuff, really. Is this something that will help this person? Can we achieve it? Does it work within the confines of the way that our business operates? I think is important. I've kind of waffled on because there's just so much to it. I don't know whether you have a view.
And I would add to that to say, firstly, when you're getting these requests in, grievances, or not even grievances, right? Just day-to-day requests, then it's really important that we think about what we can possibly do. Not only think about it, but we show our working. I think that is a really important thing. Anyone that's ever worked with me will know that I talk about 6 steps ahead. When we're stood in front of the employment tribunal, have we done everything we reasonably should have done, and can we show the tribunal that we've done that? Now, as I said, hopefully you'll never get to that stage, but it sort of focuses the mind on, have I documented it? Have I even, let's send each other a note to say, these are the things that we've considered, these are the things that we've discounted, and this is why. Because you're showing that you are doing your reasonable consideration of the requests and what might be helpful for this individual in this circumstance. So it's really important that you do that, and that you can show that as well. And we've seen that in recent tribunal cases that are coming through where they've kind of skipped the process and gone straight to
yes or no,
that's my decision, the end. Well, actually then it hasn't worked
totally.
Well
I agree. Showing your workings out and creating an audit trail in particular that the evidence is that is really important, and particularly important actually the minute when employment tribunals claims are taking so much time. So you're talking 2-3 years to actually get into a hearing. If you as the employer can't remember why you decided something, then that kind of audit trail is going to be incredibly important. are incredibly
Absolutely.
important.
Or people have left, etc. as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
exactly.
the other thing that I just pick up on in the chat and some of the conversation as well is around the time for diagnosis and some of the wait lists that we're seeing at the moment. So, this is massive demand, particularly on the NHS, to the point where, and some people have mentioned that wait lists have been closed because they just don't have the provision to be able to meet the demand. Some of the NHS trusts that we're dealing with, one in the last few weeks has told us that they are putting their wait list at 100 years.
Wow.
100 years because of the level that are coming through and the time that it takes for them to respond, etc. So, this is, in some areas, there is a real dearth of services and provision. So it means that people are trying to navigate this in the best possible way. I think, as we've said, diagnosis is not always the requirement or the answer. The answer may be, I just need to know what's going on. What are my strengths? What are my challenges? How can I implement this in workplaces? And actually, for employers, you don't need to get a diagnosis for employees. And sometimes that can be quite a tricky thing to get into because, if you've, for example, got the provision of you support people getting a diagnosis for autism and ADHD, because they're the two most popular at the moment, what about everyone else that wants other diagnosis? Are you then going to say, no, you can't have a dyslexia one because I'm just looking after those with autism at the moment? So I would put a big waiver of caution around that, and also recognize that that's not necessary for you as an employer. You want to be able to know what strengths and challenges in the context of the job that you've employed them to do, and what's possible to be able to adjust, and what decisions do you make as a result of that. So there's a whole different area. Actually, we cover quite a lot of this on the Neurodiversity HR Masterclass that we run at Do It and Lexic. Lexic are our sister organisation. The Neurodiversity HR Masterclass is available as an open programme, and I'm going to be posting about that, and it's CPD certified as well, so come and spend the whole day with us as we take you through these. It's great.
Sounds good. Mel, there is one other question that I spotted, only because it's on my screen and there's lots of other chat after it, but I thought it was quite an interesting one. We've probably both got a bit of a view, and it's from Catherine. It says, how do you get the balance right between supporting the neurodivergent individuals' needs at work and managing frustrations in the wider team? So I'm guessing that's behavioral stuff that might be displaying. The associated behaviors often impact them, i.e. the wider team. They get stressed and anxious as a result of those frustrations. And again, this comes up fairly often. I have a case for an employer at the minute along these lines. Got a view?
Yeah, of course. Ultimately, right, we are, go back to the very principles that I talked about. We're all neurodiverse. We're all coming at things from different viewpoints and different ways of doing things. But of course, there are instances where this is going to cause real difficulty within the team. And we have to determine whether or not this is something that we want to address. Is it causing issues? Is it conduct? Or is it just a case of the others of us? If we take the principle that 1 in 5 of us is neurodivergent in a team of 10, or in this team of 5, this one person is just the difference in the team, right? In which case we need to understand what's going on for them, understand why the behavior is displaying in that particular way, and then look at whether or not it's something that should change, can change, or if there's anything we can do around it to be able to enable the individual to really shine and thrive in their own way through doing things. And sometimes the answer is going to be no. It may be that we've got a situation where the behavior just can't be tolerated, as you highlighted in that particular case. And it may be that somebody just doesn't have the skills to be able to do the job. And again, we need to follow that path to get to that point. And as line managers, it can be really important that you are doing that in a way where everyone feels supported. So I saw somebody say about adjustment envy. how come they get to take Fridays off, or how come they get to work from home more than the others? And of course, this is a tricky one to navigate, but also quite a simple one to navigate. When you're supporting somebody with a disability, it's important that others understand not the specifics of the, an individual's personal disability, but as an organisation, we are supporting those who have disabilities. And if you want to come and talk to me about yours, please do. There's a very careful way of being able to let others know that you're supporting a specific situation rather than favoritism.
Yeah,
but it's difficult.
Yeah, I agree.
What's your view?
And I think obviously I take the kind of legal take on it, and you're right. That case is a good example where clearly, behaviour, there is a line as to what employers can accommodate. I think there was another. I think it was a TK Maxx case where an employee had had a dispute with a customer over a pair of trainers. And the employee jumped over the counter and punched the customer and said, this is because of a medical condition. I can't remember whether it was a neurodiversity thing or not. But, clearly, regardless of whether that's a disability under the Equality Act or not, that kind of behavior is not okay. But the key thing that in that case, and I think it applies to the situation that we're describing, is understanding that condition sufficiently well to know, and often it's about separating out the impact of a condition versus what's just pure conduct, and actually somebody that understands a condition well and can advise on that side, I think is really important to the employer in that scenario, to be able to understand, okay, well, what was this? The employee saying it's as a result of this, but actually is it? Do they have something that's contributing to that, and how much do we factor that in? So that behavioural stuff, I think you're right, all the good stuff that you'd said too. And I think just helping the entire team understand what's actually going on, working together to try and accommodate that, but being clear on, okay, well, these are the boundaries, these are the kind of rights and wrongs in this situation, and you can't, it's not okay to be doing certain things.
Exactly.
It's
it
clearly
goes back
important.
to showing that working as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
We've got a question. So Chris Strong has reposted a question from earlier. So if we suspect that an employee may be neurodivergent and want to make reasonable adjustments to better support them, is it appropriate to suggest a formal assessment or testing? If they decline and doesn't identify as neurodivergent, what steps should we take, if any, to ensure we're still providing appropriate and effective support? This is a really interesting question.
Well, it kind of goes back to your point earlier about employers not necessarily needing to, source a formal diagnosis for people, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And the other thing I would say is, I'm not a diagnostician. Unless you are a diagnostician on this call, you're not leaving the call as a diagnostician, right? So I'm hoping that you're all leaving with a bit more knowledge about what neurodiversity is and isn't, and thoughts about how you might be able to support. If you suspect that an employee may be neurodivergent, I assume there will be particular traits and behaviours that's leading you down a route to that suspicion. And my suggestion is they're the things that you need to address and can confidently address, rather than making the alignment to assuming and, almost saying, oh, I've noticed that, I'd say a simple example, I've noticed you're always late. Do you think you might have ADHD? Because I want you, can you go and do this assessment? You just need to, you're always late. That's not okay. Is there anything I need to know about? No, fine. Well, let's look at ways in which we can help you to be on time, because that's going to be an essential requirement for this role. I know that's a really simple one. And then maybe
it's a good example. It's a really good example.
So I would say no, don't suggest a formal assessment or testing unless they come back with, oh, I think I might be, in which case absolutely, that gives you the opportunity to be able to do that. But really looking at providing the support on the basis of the conduct or the issue that you are seeing, rather than making steps towards the diagnosis or self-diagnosis or you diagnosing.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Mel, I think you may have got people excited with your 6 steps reference earlier on,
okay.
which I believe was you making the point that you should be thinking 6 steps ahead in terms of most situations. For clarity, what I don't think you were saying was that you have a magic 6-step formula for reasonable adjustments and preventing, risk at employment tribunals. But I might be wrong.
Yeah, no, you are absolutely right.
Okay.
Although I might actually go and test.
I was going to say we should work on that together, shouldn't we? We should work on that together.
Yeah, so it was the kind of magical 6 steps. So what are the steps that you need to, if you work back, think about what you're doing next, making sure that you're, documenting and being appropriate too.
Yeah. I have a similar analogy where I talk about it being a chess match and thinking a few moves ahead in terms of what might happen. And you're right, I'd taken it that. So sorry, Sarah. I think Sarah said, can you send us your 6 steps?
I'm gonna do you know what I'm gonna do this afternoon? I'm gonna see if I can make 6 steps. But the thing is, you don't want to see the LinkedIn post, because it will be like,
absolutely,
it might be 2 steps or whatever the case may be, but the point was just making sure you show you're working.
And think ahead. Yeah, all good. Okay,
brilliant.
So I think we're pretty much there, aren't we, in terms of time wise? We'd advertised that we'd finish at 11. Mel, thank you so much for sharing all of that information. It was incredible. I'm absolutely going to watch back the recording myself, which I don't usually do when we're just presenting on our own. So it was super useful, useful. And again, all of the comments in the chat are confirming that too. So I know that you're super busy doing a lot for all the stuff that's on this week.
Yes, it's a busy week, and do have a look on the neurodiversityweek.com page for other events that are happening. I'm hosting a panel of individuals who have implemented neuro-inclusive practices in their organisations tomorrow lunchtime. So do have a look at that, and you can register and it will be recorded if you're not able to attend.
Amazing. Okay, enjoy the sunshine, everybody. Until next time. And we are running a couple of other webinars. We've got one on menopause and one on redundancy, which seems a bit boring compared to this, but it's important at the minute. So do look out for details on those as well.
Right, thanks everyone.
Okay, thanks Mel, take care. Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Nick. Bye everyone.